Hello and welcome to the Metal Pack Pod, the industry's leading podcast for the global metal packaging market. The Metal Pack Pod is brought to you by the Metal Packager, the number one digital resource for the global metal packaging market. This podcast is also brought to you in association with PPG Packaging Coatings, the global leader in innovative, safe and reliable coatings. Their range of sustainable solutions help protect and beautify the world. Our podcast was recently voted in the top 10 for packaging podcasts globally, so be sure to like our podcast and receive regular updates when the next episode drops. In a first for the Metapack Pod, we explore how two companies are reshaping the global packaging industry. As metal packaging professionals, we're often very linear in our analysis, so today we're inviting the fox into the henhouse, as it were, as we welcome Origin Materials, pioneer in sustainable materials and first to market with commercially scalable PET bottle caps. Its founder and CEO, John Bissell, who will be debating with ReWater founder, Matt Crocker. ReWater is the aluminium bottle specialist, challenging plastics with refillable and infinitely recyclable bottles. In a world under pressure to reduce waste and emissions, who holds the advantage? And what will it take to win the race towards sustainable packaging? In a first for the Metal Pack Pod, we get together these opposing viewpoints to find out the latest trends and challenges in the water and packaging market. The guests share insights on regulatory changes, consumer behaviour, and the importance of designing products for recyclability. They highlight the growth of recycled aluminium and PET packaging, address misconceptions about environmental impacts, and emphasise the need for collaboration and consumer education to drive sustainable change in the industry. This debate is intended to create meaningful discussion and is useful for metal packaging professionals looking to seek a rounder view on how metal packaging is perceived within the water market, but also the challenges faced from other sectors. We hope you enjoy the episode. Matt, John, thanks very much for joining me. Looking forward to an interesting discussion about the latest trends, issues and challenges within the water and packaging market. So, thanks very much for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
No problem at all. I know we've certainly got a lot of juicy topics to get ourselves into, but perhaps as a bit of a brief overview, if you could both provide a kind of a 60-second snapshot about perhaps where we are in kind of the water and packaging market today. I know we've got lots of different issues and opportunities. So just an overview, perhaps Matt, if you can just kick us off in terms of metal packaging market. The metal packager, we're obviously a resource for the global metal packaging market, so it's a nice place to begin. And then John, you can perhaps provide a bit of balance for us. So looking forward to it. So Matt, please begin.
It's probably in a major state of disruption at the moment, the level which truly hasn't been seen before. So in the UK, you've got governmental forces, you've got the launch of EPR, you've got the spectre that is DRS, which it hovers over our heads for years. And you've got a really, really informed consumer who are socially, environmentally, they're plugged in, they're educated. And at the same time, we've got lots of headwinds. We've got economic factors, not just for us, but for the whole supply chain. And of course, this drives a huge amount of innovation in the market, which is the good news at the end of it. So in terms of water, you've got water in cartons, you've got water in cans, in PLA, in rPET, and of course, in refillable bottles made from 100% recycled aluminium, which my PR agency has said I've got to keep mentioning. So there you go. And look, I've worked in the bottled water industry for 20 years, and without wanting to sound too geeky, it's actually it's never been a more exciting time. And if you'd said to me, just a few years ago, we'd be meeting the king in Windsor Castle talking about aluminium, I'd said you're crazy. But we won the innovation award, the King's Award for Innovation this year, and it's just testament that when you have a market in mass disruption, there's lots of opportunities.
Absolutely. And John, I know I'm probably guilty of it myself as a professional with the metal packaging business. You kind of speak about aluminium, steel all day, every day, and you could perhaps be a little bit linear in your approach. So I'm looking forward to learning a lot from yourself. So some of those kind of issues, are they what you subscribe to within your market sector as well?
We're talking about largely the same industry, although different segments of it. I think the recycling seems to be a really strong push. Everybody we talk to, although every brand, every consumer, recyclability is important. I think that we tend to be focused in the US right now, and we have a different consumer base that is perhaps less well educated than you would typically get maybe in the UK, or at least we perceive it to be so. And I think that has its own challenges associated with it. Recyclability is still very important to them, but I think that the understanding of exactly how that should work and how it should come together is a bit different. I think another thing that we've seen quite a bit of, and this is certainly I'm not breaking the news on this, but I think ready-to-drink beverages has become a much larger segment and very growing segment of the market over here. And that drives, at least again in North America, an interest in barrier that hasn't really been as significant with just CSD and water as you're looking at beverages, right? CSD and water are much more resilient to low barrier materials, whereas you look at some of these more specialty beverages and gas barrier becomes really important. And so I think overall, it seems like recyclability is the dominant play, and sustainability more broadly, let's say. And of course, we're playing into that with a monomaterial package as well, just like you guys. In our case, the monomaterial package is a PET bottle with a PET cap instead of a PET bottle with a polyolefin cap. And that drives recyclability. It drives value through the recycling chain. And it actually simplifies, frankly, the procurement on the side of the brand as well. So we're excited to talk about sustainability today.
We interrupt this episode for a brief segment from our sponsors, PPG.
Packaging coatings from PPG draw on our company's 140-year history of innovation. We never stop improving our solutions to meet the evolving needs of can makers and the marketplace. That spirit of innovation results in technology like the cradle-to-cradle platinum-rated PPG Innovel Pro. PPG Innovel Pro is the latest enhancement to the world's #1 non-BPA beverage can coating. It still doesn't use any bisphenol ingredients, but experienced can makers report that it now sprays like an epoxy. Follow PPG Packaging Coatings on LinkedIn or visit packagingcoatings.com to learn more about why PPG is the coatings partner for can making excellence.
Excellent. I mean, this is probably as a result of that. I mean, this is probably a question for both of you. I mean, certainly in the last few years, recyclability, sustainability become huge, important issues within the sector that we're in. I know with the last, certainly speaking in Europe and also North America too, we've had inflationary pressures, cost of living crisis, and that potentially can cause issues within the water segment. And there's a school of thought where when there's pressure on someone's wallet, then they will tend to go for the cheaper option rather than the sustainable option. Is that potentially an issue for your industries?
I think it's about value, right? You need to, the key thing is when people don't often look for the cheapest option necessarily, they look for the best value. And so everywhere across the supply chain, that's what you've got to offer people. So you can't just go, people are going to buy cheaper and cheaper and make cheaper and cheaper. I think that's a false economy. I think what happens is prices are going to go up. You know, if you look at in the UK, only 10 years ago, if you said, I'm going to charge you £1 for a bottle of water, people would say you're crazy. If I said £2, they'd fall off their chair. And now we're seeing in places they're trying to charge £3, £4 for a bottle of plastic water. So, you know, and those pressures aren't just from us as manufacturers and brands. It's from labor, it's from taxes, it's from various different things that we can't control. So those prices are only going to go up. So you need to offer more and more value at a better product.
I think I obviously agree with your argument. Value is the thing that's important, right? It's what's your performance that's being delivered for the price that you're charging for it. I think what we've seen is obviously pretty significant turmoil in sort of economics throughout the supply chain, and so I think things that the value, let's say, that's being delivered for a given price is changing pretty significantly in real time. You know, I think just I think it was sort of time flies, but maybe a week or two ago that we saw a large aluminum rolling mill go offline in North America, which we expect to have a significant impact on aluminum pricing, for example. You know, wasn't expecting to talk about that today, but you know, it seems to be news. And so I think that those kinds of things happening, and then the trade environment impacting the ability for supply chains to respond to those kinds of events is going to cause more price volatility. I think, you know, generally speaking, again, in North America, the beverage brands they're exposed to PET whether you like it or not, or whether they like it or not, I should say. And so they can consolidate their materials exposure by going for PET caps. Again, we think they get better performance, in particular because of recyclability and oxygen barrier and gas barrier that I mentioned earlier. But I think it's a significant issue, right? I mean, price always matters, no matter how you slice it.
Absolutely. And John, you mentioned the price there. I mean, for Matt, in terms of performance, I know you've obviously worked in both sectors, and now you're firmly in the aluminium bottle camp. So it'd be nice for you to perhaps provide a bit of a perspective about performance, because we're talking about price and innovation, sustainability, but ultimately, if your product has a bit of a lukewarm reception in terms of its performance, then the consumer's only going to purchase that once. So it's obviously front and center of having a product that works, essentially. So from your kind of perspective, aluminium bottles and performance, it must be something that you're obviously very passionate about.
I mean, if we take a step back and look at the metal marketplace in the UK, so aluminium, metal drinks containers, 0.1% of the market. So 95% is plastic. The rest of it is glass and a little bit of cartons, but it's 0.1% of the market. So it's a very, very, very small part. I mean, the good news is that means there's huge space for growth. And I think some of the challenges have been that initially there's been some barriers when it's come to metal packaging. So if you take a can and it's not being resealable, then consumers haven't liked it, especially in the still market. Drinking out of a can instead of a bottle is a behavioral shift. And so when you're talking retail, you're talking rate of sale, the consumer's got to love the product. If the consumer can't get their heads around the product, or the behavioral is too big of a behavioral change, it's going to take too long to make that behavior, it comes off the shelf, right? There's no kind of time for that. So I think where we've come in is we've said, look, a bottle works. In the UK, a 28 mil neck bottle with the cap, that's the best thing. And that's a plastic bottle, right? So what we've done is we've just turned that plastic into recycled aluminium. So we're not reinventing the wheel. We're just updating the material of the product. Then you get benefits. So you can refill and you can reuse it. And then at end of life, it's fully recyclable. So what we've seen is that there's been some false starts in the metal packaging for the water industry, but that's changing. And I think the best way of underlining that is that, one of our biggest chains, Marks and Spencer's, they did a whole piece of work for 5 years. They called it the Water Transformation Project. And they tried everything. They tried glass, they tried cans, they tried our bottles, they stuck with plastic. And what they've done now for the past 2 years is, yes, plastic is still on the shelf, but they've rolled out our bottle nationally. We're 2 years in and we're seeing good growth. So I think as long as you've got the right product and the right format, I think you can win.
John, just on that note, I mean, do you think sometimes in the packaging market, the various materials can be perhaps a little bit too confrontational? I mean, Matt mentioned there about the size of the can water market is very small, and essentially for this industry to grow and succeed, it only needs to take a small amount of market share away from other materials. So it's similar when we've been talking about digital printing within the metal packaging industry. It's either offset or digital, and traditionally it's been a case of, it must be either one or the other. But actually, school of thought seems to be a case of can makers can now use both, and it can perhaps be advantageous. Is that where we're at within the packaging sector? And do you think we're perhaps still being a little bit too confrontational when everyone's going to have their own view on whether something's sustainable or not?
History is what ends up telling you which one was more valid. I think the first way to think about that is that look, all big things start small, essentially, right? Or all successful big things generally start small. And so what's happening at the fringe of markets matters a lot, because that was the way, PET bottles, and actually before them PVC bottles, right? They started as a small portion of the market, overtaking glass and aluminum cans, and they ended up being a large portion of it. So I think that small things do matter, and alongside that exponential growth curves actually start very flat, right, and slow, and they only accelerate significantly later. And so it does not necessarily mean that there is always going to be plenty of space for every application in a market. A lot of these markets also have, certain kinds of winner-take-all characteristics. And so I don't know that it's actually sort of inappropriate to consider the different kinds of innovation. There are still small percentages of the market as being potentially in conflict, even if they aren't right now. So I think that does matter. I think the other thing to consider is that the specific value that's being delivered across different applications may be meaningfully different. So in this case, I think, an aluminum bottle, an aluminum can, as you said, is reusable. And the question is, does the consumer that's buying that product value the reusability of that bottle, right? And I think if they do, then that's significant. And I think it's probably a defensible innovation and technology. And I think in applications where the consumer is not valuing the reusability of that bottle, then I think it's pretty challenging, right? Sometimes I like to joke, well, it's not just me. I stole the joke from one of my engineers, which is that what's the definition of engineering? And his answer is, consider that anybody can build a bridge that stands up. It takes an engineer to build a bridge that barely stands up, which is to say you can build Roman bridges which last 2,000 years, but it uses resources and cost that was not valued by the Romans at that point in time. If they could have chosen to build a bridge that was only going to last 200 years instead of 2,000 years, they probably would have. It would have been less expensive to build. They used it for 200 years. They could have invested the additional resources in something else over that period of time. And so I think in cases where that longevity matters, then it's an excellent choice and the consumer should choose that. In cases where it doesn't, maybe it's appropriate for them to use another innovation.
Matt, on that front as well, I mean, is that something that you guys as an organisation are mindful of? It, I know metal packaging professionals, we always say that metals infinite recyclables. It's a huge message for us, but carbon footprint overall and the energy we're using tends to be certainly a big issue within the industry at the moment. And is that something you as a company are mindful of in the kind of the eyes of the consumer, that it's not just about the actual material itself, it's about the process that goes into it? So just as an industry as a whole, is that something we need to be mindful of, that we're not perhaps doing as good a job as we say we are on the sustainability front, and there's perhaps more that we can do to kind of drive that message across?
There's more you can do. I think the key thing I try and say to people, you look at LCAs, carbon emissions, water use, emission, there's so many different things. And, I've been given 3 copies of a very similar LCA and they've all kind of with vastly different results. Okay. So, I don't think we're going to solve any kind of major things in this conversation today. But what I would say is if you can use things that are made from recycled materials in the first place, that's a big tick. And when it comes to aluminium, that's really key, right? So our bottles are made from 100% recycled aluminium, which means it's 106 grams of carbon. So that is not dissimilar to a plastic bottle, and it's much less than glass. So if it's new aluminium, something different, but make something from recycled materials in the first place, big tick. If you can refill and reuse it in the middle, again, a big tick. And I agree with John, I do not like big, heavy stainless steel reusable bottles that people will buy for a fashion statement, use 20 times and then can't recycle it, right? So that's not what we're trying to do at ReWater. We're kind of that hybrid where we say to people, look, get this bottle. If you're out of home, reuse it for the day. If you're at the gym, refill it a few times, take it for the journey home with you. Some people will use it once or twice, some people use it 20 times. And then at the end of the week, it's fully recyclable. Enjoy it, recycle it, use it, get another one. So I think broadly speaking, make something from recycled materials in the first place, make sure you can refill and reuse it a number of times. And then at the end, make sure it's infinitely recyclable. And I think that's where kind of from a ReWater point of view, we believe in recycled aluminium.
That's interesting there as well. I mean, talking about consumption habits, it's just something I want to just press on that I wasn't originally looking to cover, but I think whilst we're on the subject, do you see kind of different demographics? And John, I want to get onto the North American market in a moment, but compared to, say, maybe boomer generation and millennials, Gen Z, in terms of consumption habits? Are they different across the board? And your marketing point of view, are you kind of marketing differently to different demographics, or is it a one size fits all approach? Because I know certainly my pains me to say it, but I'm kind of getting a little bit older now, and but I'm fitting into the millennial generation and consumption have. Well, we've got the filter on anyway, so that's my excuse. But no, just on millennials, always tend to have on the go water bottle to hand, but then it's kind of my parents' generation very seldom do that. This is perhaps anecdotal, but I just wanted to see from your point of view, is that something you're mindful of within your kind of marketing message? And do you think that maybe, it's kind of a twofold question, do you think that maybe differs from place to place and perhaps demographic to demographic? And then I can bring John in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think from a water side, right? So water is universal, right? We want to drink it. We all need it. So I think that's a big thing that it is. We're very conscious that when we go somewhere, anyone could be drinking this water, right? So it transcends everything. To be honest, my 72-year-old aunt and my 10-year-old son both understand the environment these days. I think it is something that's shifting. I think it's from what we see, we supply the National Trust, and we get lots of positive comments and people. The older generation reusing the bottles, they value it. They think it's an important step that they do. Equally, the younger generation as well. So I do think that things have changed. Maybe it's the middle. Maybe it's us kind of jaded in the middle that kind of, yes. But I do think everyone is listening. Everyone is aware. I don't think, I think you'd have to have your head in the sand if you didn't think that maybe single-use plastic is a slight problem and maybe you could do something about it. So I do think it's quite open. And, we have our ReWater brand, which is open to all. We obviously do a lot of custom print stuff. And so with London Zoo, we have co-branded bottles. We've just done a Harry Potter bottle for the studio tour. So I think the branding can attract different people, different demographics, but in terms of as a product, as a bottle, I think it's open to everyone.
And John, just bringing you in from a North America point of view, interesting quote. I think at the beginning of the conversation, I made a note that you said perhaps North America aren't quite as, we're a little bit further behind in terms of kind of sustainability than perhaps Europe are, and potentially Brazil. I know the likes of South America, Brazil got very high recycling rates as well. So is that something that's perhaps a concern for you guys in terms of North America falling behind a little bit?
First, I think that sustainability, you have to break into a couple different components. So you mentioned LCA earlier, and we see education and concern around LCA is quite different. I think almost make the argument completely decoupled from recyclability and end of life activities. They're obviously both driven by sustainability in the big umbrella, but different people can have very different opinions about those things and different levels of care about those. I think that let's talk about the LCA briefly, since you mentioned earlier, and I think it's actually an interesting case. So LCA does not seem to drive people to pay higher prices in North America, or at least that's sort of the lore. That's the gestalt view of the market. But it does drive market share growth. So what we've seen or heard, I should say, from a lot of brand customers is that having a more sustainable, lower LCA product has allowed them to grow brands much more quickly within their market segments than they would have expected otherwise. And that's been consistent for now almost 2 decades that I've heard that. And you can look at specific projects across the value chain or the supply chain and see that sort of market share growth. And it's quite significant. There are a lot of premium, now sort of ubiquitous brands in North America that significantly grew on the back of better LCAs, even though consumers will not pay a higher price for them. So I think that's sort of an interesting decoupling there too. Let's talk about end of life and recyclability for a moment. I completely agree that that recyclability is really important, both to consumers and to the brands. And And that has not shaken, I'd say, in our experience, and through sort of changes in sentiment around LCA and climate. The recyclability and end of life stuff seems to be persistent. Consumers care about that. Where I think that North American consumers in particular are challenged is that they expect what they put in the recycling bin here to be all recycled. And the fact is, aluminum and PET are the things that are meaningfully recycled. Glass to an extent also, but you can make arguments on whether it's good to recycle glass or not. So PET and aluminum, those are the two. They get recycled at high rates. And generally, I think substantially similar rates, depending on where you are, right? There's a large delta between how much PET and aluminum get recycled in California versus, Montana or Wyoming or something like that. But they sort of track between them. So that's where, we really feel like taking a multi-material package, which is what a beverage bottle is. It's a PET bottle with a polyolefin cap. The polyolefin cap is largely not being recycled, or not even close to at the same rates as that you see with the PET bottle in North America. Now, elsewhere in the world, in Europe, there is more polyolefin recycling than there is in North America, but it's still usually quite a bit lower than PET. PET is essentially, alongside aluminum, those are sort of the two premium materials that you'd be crazy not to recycle those, right? It's economically valuable. They can be upgraded and reused again almost indefinitely. I mean, they're wonderful materials, and so that was where bringing a PET cap to put on a PET bottle we see as really driving the end of life sustainability in a really significant way. And to the point on aluminum, you guys get improved performance in a variety of areas. We also drive improved performance in a variety of areas by putting, not the same. There's some overlap, but it's not identical. Customers, they want that. They want improved performance in those areas. So I think monomaterial packaging, that seems to be the thing that sticks, and a message that seems to stick for consumers and brands in North America, and then as far as we've seen in Europe as well.
I think that's really key. And I would say, taking my aluminium hat off for a moment, I think saying that one material, making something as simple as possible to be recycled, doesn't need separation, is an absolute no-brainer, and it should be done. So the idea of a PET bottle with a PET cap, an aluminium bottle with an aluminium cap, makes complete sense. When if that's a solution out there, if you can have one material products, then why on earth would you not have one material product? So number one, I think that's exactly the way we should go down. Putting my aluminium hat back on, I would say broadly, certainly in Europe, there's a vast difference between aluminium recycling and PET plastic recycling, in that, broadly speaking, from the EU, 75% of the aluminium ever produced is still in use today. With plastic, it's less than 10%. So there is a massive gulf between the two materials. And obviously, you ask anyone in the metal industry, they'll say it's infinitely recyclable. And I think where it stands, the problem with PET, certainly in Europe and the UK, is that it gets downcycled. So every single time it goes through that process, it's not infinitely recyclable. It goes down and down and down. So I think that's something that's worth kind of just stressing, there's a strong difference between the materials. So that's why I would put my aluminium hat on. In terms of recycling, absolutely, I think one product, one material is the way to go.
And John, just pressing you on one conversation there, I think, is it a challenge for Origin that you to kind of essentially for the average consumer on the street to differentiate between traditional PET cap and your innovation, and kind of getting your message out there? Because sometimes when, I'm guessing, the consumer will just make a purchasing choice on a day-to-day basis, they'll just potentially, playing devil's advocate here, they'll just make the consumption purchasing habit that they always have done. And I'm guessing that's a question that you have to feel kind of fairly regularly, and it's one that I'm kind of interested to deep dive into a bit more detail on this podcast.
First, I think our cap was just relatively recently introduced into the commercial market, and so we haven't seen anything like the penetration on shelves or the longevity to have that kind of data for me to answer that in sort of a practical data first way. What I'll say is the PET cap is transparent, just like the bottle is. So, and it's quite, obviously I have one of my demos here, but you can see it's quite obviously the same material as the bottle itself. And I think that's pretty differentiated. So, in fact, consumers that have seen it have remarked that it's somewhat affronting in a somewhat positive way, right? That they look at it and they say, oh, that's different. That's not the same thing. I've never seen that before. And I think that's really beneficial because any of those kinds of attention hooks, the disfluency that's driven by that, enables a story to be told around, well, what's really happening in the market right now? So if that one's recyclable alongside the bottle, what's going on with this other one that I keep buying all the time? You're telling me that that one's not recyclable alongside the bottle? And that's where I think the North American market, has lived in a kind of blissful ignorance around the recyclability of all the different materials on the bottle. And there's a general sense, I think if you pick a random consumer, many of them would believe that all plastics are equally recyclable, which I was going to pick on your comment of 10% plastics, Matt, because I think PET is quite different, right? PET, you're right, it does often get downcycled. Frequently, it gets downcycled into durable goods, right? So it gets downcycled into fiber of some sort that's going to end up in clothing. Obviously, fast fashion doesn't feed long-term use of clothing, but not all polyester is fast fashion. And I'd say it's far better for somebody to be making a polyester shirt than it is for them to be making a cotton shirt from a water perspective, an energy perspective, sustainability, all that kind of stuff. In fact, polyester is essentially unassailable as the most sustainable kind of material that you can make apparel out of. But I think consumers, at least in North America, are not sensitive to the fact that all of this other plastic does not generally get recycled. And the fact that it is only PET. And so I think the different looking cap will give brands and us to tell a little bit different story to consumers, the true story, the real story.
Excellent stuff. And just we've covered obviously the performance side of things, sustainability, but I want to touch upon the political side of things. Obviously, not in too much detail. I mean, it's very we certainly live in a very volatile environment at the moment, and certainly we could have a whole podcast on our own regarding that. But just in terms of, Matt, you mentioned it in your kind of introduction with regards to DRS, is probably a nice place to start to give us perhaps a bit of a UK perspective. I think it's certainly concerning that essentially metal's been there's no preferential treatment for metal. The powers that be at the moment, I know the MPMA are making good strides at the moment in the UK, but certainly concerning there. So and then John, we can get onto perhaps the DRS in the US shortly as well. I recently spent some time with the CMI president, and he went into detail about kind of the challenges involved with kind of state to state and kind of the configuration within the US. So we can touch upon that. But first, Matt, just from your perspective, is the current DRS legislation perhaps a bit of a concern for the industry as a whole?
Until we know the final scope of it, right, it's really difficult to comment. But what I would say is that in the UK, we've actually got quite a good curbside recycling system. In that, no matter where you are in the UK, once, twice, 3 times a week, someone will come to your house and pick up your recycling, right? Some places you have to separate it. Sometimes you put it all into one. If we're going to invest, which I think as an industry and as a government, we should invest in improving recycling rates. I think that's probably where we should start. There's been lots of conversations. Are we going to go digital? Where are we going to go with DRS? I mean, the question I would always say is, I think what's more likely, if you have something that can be recycled, are you more likely to recycle it if you had to drive it back to a supermarket and get 10 pence? Or are you more likely to recycle it if you just put it in your garden at the front? Now, what's the most likely? I'm not sure, but I would suggest most people want to recycle if they can recycle, and I think that will only increase. So let's just make it as easy as possible to recycle. And obviously, Scotland, Wales, England, we're going to have a long debate over what DRS ends up looking like. I actually think Ireland got it right. So I actually really like the return scheme in Ireland. And what they've basically done is said, we want all the packaging on the market in the first place to be recyclable, to be recycled easily. So they're banning certain types of carton because of mixed materials. They're banning certain types of plastic because they're not recycled. And so we should look, I think, from a two-pronged attack is number one, let's regulate to make sure we get the right packaging in the first place. So is that a PET bottle with a PET cap? Is that an aluminium product? Is it, let's put things in packaging that can be recycled. And then number two, let's just make recycling easy. And I think in the UK, certainly it's unique in that we are we're an island nation. We've got roads. Most people are connected. So actually curbside recycling is probably one of the easiest countries in the world for curbside recycling to work. So I would say, let's invest in councils, let's invest there, let's improve that. Or more likely, we can have lots of politics, lots of conversations, and in 5 years' time, still be talking about what DRS should be. But that's my personal opinion.
It all sounds so straightforward, isn't it, when you put it that way? I mean, John, in terms of the North America side of things, is the complexities involved, where Matt kind of alluded to there, the fact that for essentially DRS and recyclability to succeed, you need to keep things simple for the consumer, and the kind of the complex nature of North America, kind of individual states taking responsibility. Does this kind of cloud kind of the message further in terms of recyclability, and then also to his point, whose responsibility is it? Is it ultimately the consumer to recycle, or do we need to make it straightforward, and it's the brand's responsibility to make products that work and take the issue of recycling out of the hands of the consumer? So apologies there. There's about 2 or 3 loaded questions there, but it's be good to get a bit of an overview about the North American market, perhaps for our European listeners who aren't quite as well acquainted with the issue of. This is probably a general packaging issue rather than necessarily to do with the water market, but interesting also.
Certainly, I hear about sort of administrative issues, having different deposit schemes and different recycling schemes across the U.S. It is driven, as you said, by the states. What I think makes a difference is that the states are so geographically large that I'm not sure that it's so much more complex having different sort of deposit recycling schemes across the U.S. Just because of the size. I think it's probably not so different than having, our states are often geographically the same size or larger than European countries, right? And so I think that's not so bad. What I vehemently agree with in what you said, Matt, and I think it is absolutely critical, or we're not going to get ourselves out of this mess, is designing packaging for recyclability at the beginning. I think it's just so important, because otherwise it's sort of like a toddler walking in, tearing up the room, and then leaving it all for somebody else to clean up every single time, right? And having these multi-material packages that are difficult or perhaps even impossible to disassemble, it makes recycling so much more challenging. And I think, I suspect that if recycling, or if the packaging were developed for recycling at the front end, that the market would actually take care of almost all the rest of it. I'm not sure that you have to legislate the other pieces. Now, I'm a bit more free market probably than the majority of the population, but I genuinely think that if you forced companies to demonstrate the recyclability of their packages in economically feasible ways, I think that the rest of it would all sort of come together. Because these recycling businesses are actually, they can be quite profitable. If you don't have 80% garbage coming through with the recycling stream that has to get sorted out and thrown away, if you're actually getting value for this stuff, you can recycle all of this stuff quite profitably. People will do so. But the problem is, as you said, we get these packages that are multi-laminate, different materials. There's absolutely no way that you're going to recycle it, all the rest of it. It's quite challenging.
Just on the note as well with the North American market, I mean, is it a concern to you that I know the last 10 years, the environment, sustainability has been front and center of many global brands' marketing rhetoric and kind of belief in how to drive a business forward, with kind of changing administrations globally. Many essentially companies seem to have reined back a little bit on their rhetoric there. So do you think that's perhaps a concern that changing administrations has perhaps not necessarily derailed the sustainability message, but perhaps we're not going in the right direction when we're talking about environment sustainability? But that's from an outsider looking in for the North American market. Perhaps you're in the North American market yourself, that you perhaps have maybe a slightly different take on things. Just curious about that side of things.
There's obviously an effect, right, on that kind of thing. I think that effect is often the visible components, the more visible components become less visible. Not so much that the actions are changing in the underlying organizations. Obviously, we're talking about a big bulk market. So certainly I'm sure there are companies that are, significantly pulling back on their environmental targets. But many of the ones that we talk to are not. They're sticking to them. And they're pretty long range targets. What I think actually has had perhaps the largest impact is trade policy. So the Western economies, the developed economies rely on each other for all sorts of different goods. Precision manufacturing tends to come out of Europe and Asia. Depending on the kinds of manufacturing that you're doing. Raw materials come from various places. These are not homogeneous economies where every single economy is the same. And if you cut them off from each other, they just keep operating the same way they were before. It changes things, and it increases cost very significantly. And I think that what that does, aside from passing cost on to consumers and all those kinds of things, is it makes it much harder for the economy to invest in new things. Right. And I mean, new capital projects, new technologies, all those kinds of things. And so I think that actually may be the, taking off I'm making and selling caps, because we are obviously figuring out how to navigate our way through those kinds of economy challenges. But if I put on sort of my, I don't know, I'm not an economist, but my macroeconomics hat, I think that the challenge is, in order to achieve all of the environmental targets that we wanted to achieve as a species, you have to invest in new things. And all of those new things just got way more expensive. And I think that's actually the biggest challenge, as opposed to just the sentiment side.
And Matt, have you felt that in terms of having to pass on those costs to consumer, in terms of you bearing the brunt of tariffs and other governmental policies, and how are you looking to kind of circumnavigate those?
In short, we are being attacked from multiple angles, right? So, we've got EPR in the UK, which, John touched on it before. The great thing with certain materials when you recycle is they're profitable. So, you can recycle aluminium in the UK at profit. So when you have EPR, which is effectively a fee you have to pay per ton of packaging you put in the marketplace, should you be paying for aluminium when aluminium is profitable, or a similar amount, not a dissimilar amount to plastic when it's not profitable, or glass? So I think EPR has had an impact. It's affected everyone, but it has affected aluminium, I think, maybe unfairly. I would say in terms of the aluminium pricing, the biggest impact of recent times is Ukraine, Russia, right? So that's from pre then, you could get aluminium 1,600 a ton. Now it's 2,600 a ton. It spikes at 3,300 a ton. So I think there are always going to be global factors that affect things. We try and hedge as much as we can. But I think the key thing for us really is just, we are a premium product. We've tried to keep our pricing as stable as possible, at least for the first few years when we launch this product, because you can't launch something at a premium end and then make it more expensive. So it's just one of those difficulties. But I think I can't remember a time in the last 20 years when there haven't been some form of price pressure, right? There's always something, whether it's VAT going up 5%, EPR, a war, there's always something, and they're just things we have to battle. But as John said, we all work together as a global economy, and when there's tariffs, not tariffs here, there, it does make it more difficult, more challenging.
Absolutely. But just looking, we've obviously been discussing kind of the background, the here's and nows, but also curious about the future as well. So from a kind of a brand point of view, Matt, your strategy for the next few years? Are you optimistic for the future? Certainly with your answer so far, it appears to be that you're kind of bullish that there is, because the size of the market is still relatively small for the metal packaging market for water, that you seem to think there's a lot of growth to be had yet.
All the signs are positive, right? So you've got, I mean, think of Ball, Ball Corp, one of the biggest aluminium drinks producers, and they sold their aerospace division, and they're using at least some of those proceeds to buy factories in Europe. So they've taken over Alucan in Spain, and they're growing that capacity, which I think is a really positive step for the European market, because as we move away from other materials into aluminium, supply is going to be a real constraint. So having big players invest more in Europe is a real boon. I think we're starting from a small space, right? 0.1%. So I think there is a bit growth. I think education will continue. It started with Sir Attenborough, and it's going to keep going and going and going. And like anything, there's waves. And I think we're in a current cycle where maybe in certain areas sustainability is less important, but that it's short term, and give it another month, 3 months, 6 months, that will come back to the forefront again. So no, I'm really positive. I think for the first time in a long time, the market is being shaken, is being disrupted. And I think, if you're there and you're ready, you've done the research, you've looked at everything, and you've got the position, then there's lots of wins to be had.
And John, it certainly seems like speaking to two disruptive brands here, which is really exciting for us as a podcast. And from your side of things, do you share that similar sentiment?
We see enormous amounts of demand for PET caps. I think it's a pretty obvious solution, as in obvious that you needed it. The market wanted it. Our customers have asked us for it. Obviously, the larger story is we were a materials development firm, and our customers kept asking us for a PET cap because they figured we could use our materials expertise to solve that problem in a way that nobody else has. And so we think there's a long road of making a lot more caps to be put on a lot of bottles ahead of us, and we're excited to walk that road.
Excellent stuff. And just one final question in terms of your own businesses. In talking about obviously kind of biggest misconception as a business, if you can kind of summarize in one sentence or phrase about if you had just one argument to tell a potential customer about your business, about your product, where would you go? Matt, if you could start us off.
I would say the biggest misconception, and we even touched on today, is the CO2 footprint. So the biggest thing that people will bash aluminium with is, it's got a massive CO2 footprint. And yes, initially, brand new aluminium does have a CO2 footprint, right? So I think our biggest thing is saying to people, aluminium is infinitely recyclable. We use 100% recycled aluminium for our bottles, 106 grams. So it is that kind of piece that, don't often look at these big headline numbers, actually look into the detail, look at the information. And I'd say, metal isn't a hugely CO2 footprinted piece because it's infinitely recyclable. And so that's, I think, the biggest thing that we kind of get hit with, that we kind of hit back.
And John, I'm happy to let you have the final word here about biggest misconception for you as a business.
Our direct customers, the brands, tend to be pretty sophisticated, and we engage with them, in ways that make a lot of sense. And I don't think we've seen a lot of misunderstanding there. I would say if I could, I would talk to consumers, and I would say, look, recyclability is a much more complex undertaking than I think North American consumers realize. And getting on the topic of earlier, not all materials are equally recyclable. Not all plastics, Matt, are equally recyclable. And in many ways, PET is the best option out of the recyclable plastics. It's by far the most recyclable. It's the one that's most economically recyclable. And being able to move every single piece of packaging product that we can into PET and out of other materials makes a huge difference.
Excellent stuff. Well, certainly we've covered a few juicy topics that we could have spent a whole podcast on. So I know it's been a whistle-stop tour, learning a little bit more about the packaging and water market. I've certainly learned a lot, and it makes a change for us at the Metal Packager to kind of have a focused debate around a certain subject matter rather than kind of too tailored towards metal packaging. So it's certainly been unusual for us, but I've certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure our listeners will take away plenty here. So Matt, John, really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll look forward to speaking to you soon.
Take care.